So in this second video, we're going to look at midpoints and segment bisectors. So a midpoint, right? Dissect your word. So a midpoint is a point that's in the middle technically, but our proper definition is a point that divides a segment into two congruent segments. So it's a point that divides a segment into two congruent segments. So if you look at your diagram, we have segment AB, and then we have M. M is going to be our midpoint in this situation, just for the sake of this problem. So if M is the midpoint, that means it's in the middle, which means that segment AM is going to be congruent to segment MB. It's going to split it in half, basically. So if M is the midpoint, then I know segment AM is congruent to segment MB. Okay. And then a segment bisector is very similar to a midpoint. It's actually something that goes through the midpoint. So it is a point, line, segment, ray, or plane that intersects a segment at its midpoint. Okay. So the midpoint splits it in half, and the segment bisector goes through that midpoint. So in this diagram here, the segment bisector is actually this little line there that goes through the middle. So let's call it, for the sake of this problem, let's call that line L. So we would say that line L is the segment bisector of line AB. Okay. Handwriting got a little sloppy there. Okay. Is. Okay. This isn't the best stylus. So line L is the segment bisector of line AB because it goes through its midpoint. So let's look at some examples with that. Example 2 says identify the segment bisector of AB, then find the measure of AB. So first, when it says identify means name, right? Tell me what the segment bisector is. Well, if you look at your diagram, you have segment AB, and please notice the little tick marks. The little tick marks say, hey, the left and right are congruent. And if the left and right are congruent, that means M is the middle. So M here is going to be the midpoint. The segment bisector is what goes through it. And what's going through it right now is this little ray ML. So the bisector is going to be ray ML. And make sure you name that properly. Start at the end point, head towards the arrow. Now when it says find the measure of AB, remember when there's no bar above it, that means to find the measure. Well, again, look at your picture, they're congruent. So if one side's 5.5, then the other side is also 5.5. And so we just need to find the total, which means add up your parts. This is going to be one of those part plus part equals whole problems that I talked about on the front. So 5.5 plus 5.5 is going to give you your total, which is 11. So the measure of AB equals 11. Okay. Number 2, identify the segment bisector of segment ST, then find the measure of ST. So again, notice the little congruent symbols, the little tick marks, right? That means the left and right are congruent. So that means M is the midpoint, and the line that goes through M is the bisector. So this line here is your segment bisector. So we're going to say that that is line MR. Use your 2 points. Now we need to find the measure of ST, but this one's a little trickier because it doesn't actually give you any measurements. It's giving you expressions. It's telling you that segment SM has a measurement of x plus 12, and the other side has a measurement of 8x minus 2. So somehow we're going to have to figure out what x is, which means you're going to have to set up an equation. Now remember, things are congruent, which means they have the same measure, which means they're equivalent. And when things are equivalent in math, you can set them equal to each other. So when two things are congruent, set them equal. That's a big rule for this class just in general. When things are congruent, you will typically set them equal to each other. So we are going to do x minus 12 equals 8x minus 2. And then we're going to solve. I'm going to subtract my 8x over. That's going to give me negative 7x. I'm going to add my 12 over. That is going to, oh, I copied this wrong. My bad. X plus 12. That's why I was confused. So I'm going to subtract my 12 over. That's going to give you negative 14. Divide both sides by negative 7, and you should get positive 2. But you're not done. It didn't say find x. It said find the measure of ST. Well, you have x. You have labels, so plug it in. So what we're going to do is plug 2 back into the little parts we were given, x plus 12 and 8x minus 2. And a really easy way to check this is make sure they end up being the same. If you get the one side's 10 and the other side's 7, then you did some math wrong and you need to go back and double check it. So I'm going to plug 2 in. So over here, 2 plus 12 means that this measures 14. Plug it in over here as well. 8 times 2 minus 2, that's going to be 16 minus 2, which is also 14. Both parts are 14. That means we're good. And if both parts are 14, then the total is going to be 28 because it asked for the total here, ST. ST equals 28. Okay. This actually brings me to another kind of problem. So we've talked a lot about our part plus part equals whole problems. I like to call this a part equals part problem. That's what these are, part equals part. So our two main types of problems this chapter are going to be part plus part equals whole and part equals part. And to figure out which one you need to do, you just need to figure out what information you're given. So in B, we're being asked to do the same thing. First, identify the segment bisector. Well, if you look at your midpoint M, there's nothing additional going through it. So the bisector in this situation is going to be the same as your midpoint. So it's M. And now we need to find our measure. And you have equivalent parts here, right? We have our congruent symbols. We have our tick marks, which means they're congruent. So the two parts are congruent. So we can say that part equals part. So set your two parts equal. We're going to do 2x plus 3 equals 4x minus 7. And solve. I'm going to subtract 4x from both sides. That gives you negative 2x. So that gives you negative 2x. And then subtract your 3 over, and that gives you negative 10. And oops, I just realized I changed colors halfway through the problem. That's okay. Divide both sides by negative 2. You're going to get positive 5. Again, we weren't asked to find x. We're asked to find the whole measurement. So plug it in. Plug 5 back in up here. 2 times 5 is 10. 10 plus 3 is 13. Plug it in up at the top again. 4 times 5 is 20. 20 minus 7 is 13. So those ended up being equivalent, which means we did our work right, which means our total is 13 plus 13. So the measure of ST equals 26. Okay. We see these a lot, so make sure you go back through it if it's confusing. Again, our two main types of problems are part plus part equals whole, and then part equals part. So you set up your equations and solve for the most part. And then in the next video, we're going to look at midpoint and distance formulas.